The room didn't go silent all at once. It dropped in pieces, the way a wave pulls back before it really hits, conversations trailing off in little clumps until the only sound left was the air conditioner ticking against the church windows, and somewhere, faintly, a baby fussing in the vestibule. My father stood 3 feet in front of me with his hand flat against the end of the pew like he was bracing it or himself. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing people never understood about him. He never had to shout. "This isn't a place for you," he said. "Today is about family, the kind that stayed." I felt every face in those back rows turned toward us. I'd already half stood, already shifted my weight toward the aisle, because 33 years had taught me exactly how this went, and I knew the kindest thing I could do for my sister on her wedding day was leave quietly and let them tell whatever story they wanted about why. Then a hand closed gently around my forearm. Not a grab. More like the way you'd steady someone stepping off a boat. I turned, and the groom was standing there in his rented tux with the boutonniere already crooked, and his eyes were doing something I hadn't seen pointed at me in years. They were full. "Doctor," he said, loud enough to carry. "Please, don't leave." The word landed in that room like a dropped plate. "Everybody here," he went on, and his voice cracked right down the middle of it, "deserves to know exactly who just walked in." My father's face went the color of the candle wax on the altar. And God help me, for one cowardly second, I wished the kid had just let me go. I should back up. I drove in the night before. 6 hours straight up through the mountains with a thermos of gas station coffee gone cold in the cuff holder, and a wedding card on the passenger seat that I'd bought at a CVS off the interstate, because I'd been too proud to assume I was invited and too soft to show up empty-handed. I wasn't invited. Not really. My cousin had called me 3 weeks earlier, the way you'd mentioned the weather. "You're coming to Hannah's wedding, right? It's the second Saturday in June, at Grace Lutheran." There was a pause where she realized I didn't know, and then she filled it with chatter so neither of us had to sit in it. I said, "Of course. What else do you say?" "She's my little sister." I checked into a Hampton Inn off the highway, the kind with the breakfast that's just waffle batter and a coffee machine. And I sat on the edge of the bed in my scrubs because I'd come straight off a shift, and I looked at the dress hanging on the back of the bathroom door. Gray. Simple. I'd bought it at a Macy's near the hospital 2 years ago for a colleague's retirement dinner and worn it maybe twice since. No jewelry except the little gold studs my mother gave me when I turned 16, the only thing of hers I ever managed to keep. I don't own anything flashy. People assume surgeons live like the ones on TV. The truth is, I've been paying down a number with 6 figures in it for a decade, and the nicest car I'd ever owned was a 2014 Accord with a check engine light I'd learned to ignore. I want to be honest about something because the whole rest of this only makes sense if I am. I could have told them. Any of them. For years. I could have called my father the week I matched into a residency program that takes maybe 3 people a year and said, "Here, look, this is who I am now." I could have mailed him the photo of me in my white coat. I could have shown up to Thanksgiving and laid it all out like a hand of cards. Sometimes I think I should have. But I knew exactly what would have happened because it had happened before in smaller ways. My whole life. My father did not believe a thing was real until it was useful to him. And the second my success became useful, something to mention to the men at the lodge, something to soften the story he'd been telling about his runaway daughter, it would stop being mine. It would become his, a thing he'd allowed, a thing that proved him right all along. So I didn't tell him. I told myself that was dignity. Some nights I knew it was just a different kind of pride, the kind that looks quieter from the outside. The story he told about me, the one that had calcified over a decade into family fact, went like this. I'd left when my mother was sick, run off to the city the same year she was diagnosed, chosen my big ambitions over the woman who raised me. I'd missed her last months. I'd missed the funeral, and no amount of grief on my part would ever buy that back. Here is what actually happened. I was a second-year resident. We worked 100 hours some weeks, the legal cat be damned, and I asked for time off and was told that if I left mid-rotation I could kiss the program goodbye, and I made the worst calculus of my life. I told myself she had months. I told myself I'd come at the holidays. She had 11 days. Nobody called me until the ninth one, and by the time I'd driven through the night she was already somewhere I couldn't reach, breathing on a machine. And she died at 4:40 in the morning while I was still 40 minutes out on the interstate with my hazards on, going 90, crying so hard I had to pull over twice. I missed her by less than an hour. My father has never let me explain the 40 minutes. In his version, there are no 11 days, no phone calls that came too late, no hospital that wouldn't grant the leave. There is only a daughter who wasn't there. And every year that I let him keep telling it, I let it get a little more true. So no, I wasn't invited to Hannah's wedding. I came anyway. I told myself it was for her. Maybe it was. Maybe I just wanted one time to stand in the same room as the people I came from and not be a story they told about a daughter who left. The church was already humming when I got there Saturday morning. Lilies and white ribbon, a sound man fussing with a feedback squeal, my Aunt Carol in a fascinator that belonged at a different, fancier wedding. I slid into a pew near the back and folded my hands in my lap and made myself small in the way you learn to make yourself small when you've spent 10 years standing at the foot of beds, delivering news nobody wants. Stillness is a skill. I've got it. People noticed me. That was the strange part. They noticed me and then they unnoticed me, eyes sliding off like I was a smudge on a window. A second cousin half raised a hand to wave and then thought better of it. Two women I didn't recognize leaned their heads together. Nobody came over. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was confusion. I didn't fit the shape of the day they'd all agreed on, and people will work very hard to keep a day the right shape. I caught a glimpse of Hannah through a side door, in her dress, her hair half up with a girl I didn't know, pinning the rest, and my chest did something complicated. The last time I'd really seen her, she was 19 and furious with me, parroting our father's lines back at me on the phone. You broke Mom's heart. You broke all our hearts. She was 28 now. There were laugh lines starting at the corners of her eyes. I'd missed all of it. The whole quiet stretch of a person becoming herself, and I'd missed it the way you miss a turn you didn't know was coming. My father found me about 20 minutes before the ceremony. I watched him spot me from across the sanctuary, and I watched the recognition go through him in stages. First the blank not placing, then the placing, then the placing. Then the tightening that pulled his whole face into the expression I'd carried in the back of my mind for 10 years. He came down the side aisle slow in a suit that didn't quite fit him anymore, his tie already loosened a half-inch like the day was something he was enduring rather than celebrating. "What are you doing here?" he said. Quiet. Not a question, the way he said it. "I came for Hannah. Did anybody tell you to come?" "A wedding's not an invitation-only secret, Dad." His jaw worked. "You couldn't drive 40 minutes for your mother," he said. "But you found the time for this." And there it was. He'd kept it loaded all these years, that exact number, and he fired it the second he had a clear shot. 40 minutes. He didn't even know he had the geography of my worst night memorized. I think he just felt the shape of the wound and aimed for it. I didn't take the bait. I'd learned that much. You don't argue at the foot of the bed. You stay level. "I'll sit in the back," I said. "I won't say a word. You won't even know I'm here." "Oh no," he said. That should have been the end of it. The ceremony should have happened, and I should have slipped out during the recessional and driven 6 hours home, and that would have been the visit, another data point in the long story of us. But Hannah's almost husband chose that exact moment to come looking for his future father-in-law to ask about the seating, the way grooms do, errand running and nervous, and he walked up on the tail end of it. On my father saying, low and final, "This isn't a place for you. Today is about family. The kind that stayed." I stood. I turned toward the aisle. and the groom's hand closed around my arm. His name was Marcus, and I want to tell you why a 26-year-old in a rented tux looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, because that part I didn't understand until later either. 14 months before that wedding, on a Tuesday in April, a tanker jackknifed on the interstate during a rainstorm and took 4 cars with it. I was the trauma attending on call. They brought us a wall of patients in the span of 40 minutes, and one of them was a kid, 23, unrestrained backseat passenger, blood pressure in the basement, a belly full of blood, and a liver torn nearly in half. He shouldn't have lived. Statistically, mechanically, he should not have lived. I had him on the table for 6 hours. At one point, I had my hand inside his abdomen, physically holding pressure on his vena cava while the room screamed numbers at me, and I remember thinking, very calmly, the way you think when there's no room for panic, "You are not dying on my table today. I will not allow it." He didn't die on my table. He spent 2 weeks in the ICU and walked out on his own feet, and I never saw him again, because that's how it works. You hold someone's life in your 2 hands for 6 hours, and then they become a discharge summary, and you go to the next one. I didn't even remember his face. We don't, mostly. There are too many. The kid's name was Danny. Marcus's little brother. Marcus had spent those 2 weeks living in the ICU waiting room. He'd memorized the faces of every doctor who came through those doors, and he had told me later, much later, at the reception, when we finally had a minute, that he'd asked a nurse to point out the surgeon who operated, just so he'd know who to thank. And she'd nodded down the hall at a woman in scrubs scrubbing out at a sink, too tired to do anything but nod back when he tried to say something. He never forgot the face. People remember the face of whoever saved the person they couldn't live without. That's just how the human heart files things. So when he walked up on a confrontation at his own wedding and saw a woman in a gray dress being told she didn't belong, being told to leave, he recognized her. And something in him simply refused to let it happen. "Doctor," he said, "please, don't leave." The room turned. I felt it on my skin. "You don't." My father started. "With respect, sir." Marcus didn't let go of my arm, but he wasn't holding me anymore either. He'd just sort of put himself between me and the door. "I don't think you know who this is." He looked at me and his eyes were wet, and his voice came apart on the next part. 14 months ago, my brother Danny got hit on the interstate. The doctors told us to call our family. They told us to come say goodbye. He swallowed. This is the surgeon who didn't listen to them. This is the woman who kept him alive. My brother is standing up at this wedding right now because of her. He's a groomsman. He's right there. And down the side aisle, a young man with a fading scar peeking above his collar took one step forward, and his face was doing the same thing his brother's was. And he said to the whole stunned room in a voice that shook, "Hi, Doc." I have stood in a lot of rooms in my life. Rooms where I told people their child wasn't coming home. Rooms where I delivered the kind of news that ends one version of a person's life and begins another. I am, professionally, very good at being the steadiest thing in a room. I was not steady. My eyes burned. I had to look at the floor. My father had gone completely silent. When I finally looked up at him, he wasn't looking at me at all. He was looking at the 2 young men, at the scar, at the way the whole congregation was now looking at his daughter. The runaway, the one who didn't stay, like she'd descended from somewhere. And I watched the story he told for 10 years die right there on his face, not gently. It died the way things die when they've been propped up too long, all at once, and ugly, and with a kind of horror in his eyes that I almost felt sorry for. Almost. Hannah came out then. Somebody must have gone to get her, because she came out half-dressed in her gown with her veil not pinned, which you're not supposed to do. The groom's not supposed to see. But nobody cared anymore about supposed to. She stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, and she was looking back and forth between me and her father and Marcus and Danny, trying to assemble it. And I saw the exact moment she understood that the sister she'd been raised to resent had spent the last decade with her hands inside dying strangers, putting them back together, while our family told a story about a girl who couldn't be bothered. "You're a," she started, and couldn't finish it. Trauma surgeon, I said. It came out smaller than I meant it to. Level 1 center, up in the city. I'm the section chief now. Have been for 2 years. The fascinator aunt sat down hard in a pew. I want to tell you that what I felt in that moment was triumph. The internet loves that story. The big reveal, the family that wronged you, brought low, the satisfaction of watching them choke on it. And I'd be lying if I said no part of me felt it. There was a part of me, a small, mean, tired part, that had wanted exactly this for 10 years and never let myself say so. But mostly what I felt was grief, because none of it was the point. Don't you see? Marcus thought he was defending me. He thought the white coat was the thing that proved I deserved to be in that room. And he wasn't wrong, not to him. But standing there with the whole congregation looking at me like I'd grown a halo, I understood something I'd been circling for years and never landed on. If I'd failed, if I'd washed out of residency, if I'd ended up bartending or broke or just ordinary, I still wouldn't have deserved to be thrown out of my sister's wedding. The title didn't make me worth keeping. It just made it impossible for them to keep pretending I wasn't. And there's a kind of sorrow in being loved for the wrong reason that's almost as sharp as not being loved at all. They held the ceremony. Of course they did. Hannah married her firefighter under the lilies, and I sat in the back where I'd put myself. And I cried during the vows, real crying, and the woman next to me who'd refused to wave handed me a tissue from her purse and squeezed my shoulder. And I let her, because what else are you going to do? It was at the reception that my father came and found me again. I'd taken a glass of wine I wasn't drinking out to the little courtyard behind the fellowship hall, where they'd strung up cafe lights, and somebody's Bluetooth speaker was playing the kind of country that makes everybody at a wedding cry into their beer. I needed a minute away from the well-meaning relatives who suddenly wanted to know all about me, who suddenly had 100 questions, who suddenly remembered they'd always known I'd make something of myself. I didn't have it in me to be gracious to all of it at once. He sat down on the low brick wall next to me without asking. For a while, neither of us said anything. Inside, somebody got the crowd to do the electric slide and lost half of them by the second verse. I didn't know, he finally said. You could have, I said. You could have known any time you wanted. You just had to ask me one question and then believe the answer. He flinched at that. I watched him want to argue and decide not to, which for my father was his own kind of confession. That night, he said, his voice was rough. Your mother. They told you to come. They called me on the 9th day, Dad, of 11. Nobody told me she was dying until she was already gone past talking. I drove all night. I missed her by less than an hour. I have never once stopped doing the math on that hour. I heard my own voice go flat, the way it does when I'm holding something back from breaking through. And you turned it into 40 minutes I chose. You told that story so many times, I think you believe it now. He put his face in his hands. My father is not a man who puts his face in his hands. I'd seen him do it exactly once before. At the funeral I supposedly skipped. I needed somebody to be the reason, he said into his palms. She was just gone, and there wasn't any reason, and I couldn't stand that there wasn't any reason. So I made you the reason. He looked up, and his eyes were red. That's the truth, and it's worse than anything you think of me. I sat with that. It was, in its way, the most honest thing he had ever said to me. And here's where the story is supposed to swell, where I'm supposed to forgive him, and we embrace, and the cafe lights twinkle, and 10 years dissolve. That's not what happened. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, I said. Because it isn't, and you've used my mother as a weapon against me for 10 years, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't cost me something. It'll take a long time to get back. He nodded. He didn't try to talk me out of it. That was new too. But I'll tell you what we can do, I said. You can stop telling the story. Today, every version of it. To Aunt Carol, to the lodge, to whoever you tell things to. You start telling the truth, even when the truth makes you look smaller. And you let me back in slow. Not because I cut somebody open and got famous in a waiting room. Because I'm your kid, and I was always your kid, and I would have been worth picking up the phone for even if I'd never done a single impressive thing in my life. He was quiet a long time. Are you happy? He asked. Up there, doing what you do. It surprised me. In 10 years, he had never asked me a single question about my life that wasn't a setup for an accusation. I thought about lying. It's the easy thing, at a wedding, with the lights and the music, and a man finally asking. But I'd just spent a whole afternoon watching what lies do when you let them sit, and I was tired all the way to the bone of pretending. I'm good at it, I said. I'm really good at it. I said people who shouldn't get saved. And some nights I drive home at 4 a.m. and there's nobody there, and I eat cereal standing over the sink, and I wonder what I traded for it. So, I don't know if happy is the word, but I'm not sorry. He nodded slowly, and he didn't fix it, and he didn't make it pretty, and he didn't say I love you or I'm proud, because that's not who he is, and a wedding doesn't turn a person into someone else. But he reached over and put his hand on top of mine on the brick wall, rough and heavy and shaking just slightly, and he left it there. And we watched the lights for a while. Inside, somebody whispered something to him on our way back in. I heard it. A cousin's husband, half drunk and impressed. Is it true? Your daughter's the big surgeon up in the city? The one that saved that kid? I waited for it. The old reflex. The way he'd take a thing of mine and make it his. Allow it. Take the credit by proximity. He didn't puff up. He didn't wave it off either, the way he might have a day before. He just looked at the man and then he looked at me, standing next to him in my plain gray dress, and he said, "Yeah, she is." And then, quieter, like it cost him something. I should have been bragging about her years ago. That one's on me. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to everything. But it was a true thing said out loud in front of other people, and from my father, that was rarer than any rank. Danny found me before I left. The kid I'd had my hands inside of for 6 hours, walking and laughing with a beer in his hand and a girl on his arm, alive in a way that's hard to describe when you remember somebody the last way you saw them, which for me was gray and open on a table. He didn't know what to say, and neither did I, so he just hugged me, hard, and said into my shoulder, "Thank you for not listening to them." And I understood he meant the doctors who told his family to say goodbye. And I held on to him a second longer than was professional, and told him to wear his seatbelt in the back seat from now on, and he laughed wet and promised he would. I drove home that night instead of staying over. 6 hours back through the mountains. Somewhere around the second hour, the adrenaline drained out, and I had to pull off at a rest stop and sit in the Accord under the orange lights and cry the way you cry when something you stopped hoping for finally, partly happens. Which is not happy crying and not sad crying, but some third thing that doesn't have a word. I don't know if my family and I are fixed. I don't think families work the way the satisfying stories say they do, where one big day burns it all clean. My father still has my number. He's used it twice since. Both times it was awkward, and both times he hung up first, but he's calling. The story he tells now has 11 days in it and a daughter who drove all night and missed it by an hour, and that's not nothing. That's a whole different daughter than the one I was a week before the wedding. I keep thinking about what Marcus believed when he grabbed my arm. That I needed defending. That the proof of my worth was the white coat and the saved kid and the title that made the room go quiet. He was being kind. He saved me in his way the way I once saved his brother, and I'll never be able to tell him it was the wrong rescue without it sounding ungrateful. So I'll say it here to you instead, because maybe you've got somebody in your life you quietly written a story about. A sister who left, a son who failed, a father who wasn't there, the ones who don't announce themselves, the ones who show up in plain dresses and old cars and sit in the back without making a scene. You don't get to find out they were somebody all along and only then decide they mattered. They mattered the whole time. They mattered before anybody handed them a title. The kid who washed out matters as much as the one who came home a hero. I needed the white coat to get back into that church. And that's the saddest part of the whole story, not the triumphant part. Pick up the phone before there's a wedding. Ask the quiet one how they're really doing, and then sit still long enough to believe the answer. Tell the people you've misjudged that you're sorry while you can still say it to their face and not to a stone. I missed my mother by less than an hour. I think about that hour every day of my life, and I would trade every saved patient, every quiet room I've ever commanded, the whole white coat and all of it, for one more honest conversation with her on the brick wall in the dark. You won't get that hour back. So go now. Go while it's still just a phone call and not a thing you'll spend 10 years driving toward in the dark with your hazards on. For 10 years, I let my father's version of me stand because correcting it felt like begging, and I told myself silence was dignity. It wasn't. It was fear, wearing a nicer coat. The night my mother slipped away 40 minutes before I reached her, I learned that the things you don't say out loud don't stay quiet. They harden into the story other people tell about you. My father needed a reason for a loss that had none, so he made me the reason, and I let him, and that single act of letting it slide cost me a whole decade of a family I could have been fighting for. That's the part I keep coming back to. The wedding didn't fix us because Marcus stood up and announced what I do for a living. A title never healed anything. What started to heal us was the moment I finally sat on that brick wall and told my father the plain truth without flinching and without softening it to spare him. Honesty is a muscle, and I'd let mine go slack for years. The day I used it, things finally moved. If there's anything I'd hand to you, it's 3 small things I had to learn the slow way. The first is that being a decent person isn't about how the room sees you. I was worth picking up the phone for long before anyone called me doctor. And so are you, and so is the quiet one in your life you've quietly written off. Treat people as if their worth doesn't depend on what they've accomplished. Because it doesn't. And Danny living to dance at that wedding doesn't make my life count more than the version of me who might have washed out. The second is to keep your eyes open enough to tell a real story from a convenient one. My father believed his own myth because it hurt less than the truth. I almost did the same with my pride. Look hard at the stories you tell about the people who disappointed you and ask whether you built them out of facts or out of your own ache. And the third is plain endurance. Nobody gets the easy version. I held a stranger's life in my 2 hands for 6 hours, and I drove 6 hours home alone and ate cereal over the sink, and I kept showing up anyway. You won't get the clean ending either. My father still hangs up first. But he's calling. Hannah texts now. That's not a movie ending. It's a real one, earned an inch at a time. Don't wait for a grand reveal to recognize someone. Pick up the phone tonight while it's still just a phone call and not a stone you're standing over, wishing you'd said the thing while they could still hear it.